Thank you all for coming. The title of this talk is Hybridize or Disappear, which is a show I curated last year in Lisbon and Porto. But we're not really going to address the show as such. We're going to use the show as a background to kind of discuss a number of ideas. Just to give a little bit of context on the show, it's happened in the National Contemporary Art Museum in Lisbon, and then the City Hall Gallery in Porto from April last year until September. And I showed 9 artists, including Cécile B. Evans, Neil Balufa, Antoine Català, Diogo Evangelista, Oliver Larrick, Magali Royce, Shanna Moulton, Katia Novitskova, and Laure Provost. And the exhibition, in a very broad way, analyzed contemporary visual culture, and namely hybrid formats that are produced from friction between binaries that I was kind of questioning, such as, for example, organic and artificial, textual and objectual, the virtual and the real or the actual, etc., among many others, spirituality and consumerism. But the main focus, actually, of the show was the friction between matter or materiality or sculpture and the visual, which is one of the biggest topics we're also going to discuss here. My selection of artists, and specifically of the artworks I was showing, they were all exploring somehow how visual is handled as matter and how images became objects and how objects also became images. So it was an exploration around this free flow of forms. And maybe to start off the conversation, I mean, the show was really approaching visual culture and commenting on popular culture, visual culture, and maybe it could be a good way to start off to discuss a little bit how we all kind of deal with visual culture or popular culture in our own practices. Who would like to start? Venus?
It's interesting, like talking about like hybrid forms and then like pop cultures and visual cultures, because like contemporary art has a very long history of appropriating pop culture, but in the past it's like mostly it's just like, oh, let's grab an image and make a collage of it, that kind of thing. So I find it very interesting how artists like kind of like because pop culture is basically our environment now, like what we're living in. Like if we think like it can also be, I mean, it's like kind of like a site specific, it's a site, like it's just like where we are like immersed in. So it's just like, it's because João talked about image as object and all that, we are dealing with all these objects, the network of all these objects that explodes and implode at the same time. So it's interesting when I work with Corporate Aruna Nonchai, like on the solo show last year at the Ulan Center in Beijing. I actually like witnessed the whole like process of how the artists work, like, and then I think it's interesting of like how we bring this like whole production of visual forms of pop culture or other cultures like hip hop that is like basically viral, like that is like hip hop is now seen as like the third like big turn of like the pop culture history, and like how like the artists like expand the idea of like our culture, like as pop culture, like including music, like film and music videos and all that, into a site. So like how he had like Boy Child collaborating with him and people like from Hood by Air, like creating this whole scene, and then like that is interesting because like it kind of like, what is our production if a brand is doing the same thing, like how this like site of pop culture is like when it's moved into the whole artistic context with the burden of art history, and then how it all mixed together. I found it very interesting. I'm still learning like what kind of like things can be done, like because I work with a lot of like contemporary Chinese artists, and of course because of the political reality there, people would say that, oh, like is it socially engaged work or something, which kind of like warns me about the idea like is art kind of like not part of society. Like when you say that socially engaged, there is like a very obvious imagery. It's just like, oh, something is like getting into a secluded bubble. So I found it interesting when João and they like bring up, and also Lascelles' work that are like merging images from popular culture. It's just like, I think it's like a big reminder of like art is like actually like part of it. It's like an immersion. Yeah.
Yeah, I think music videos in particular are an amazing resource at the moment, because there's never, like, a music video never just has one reference. And I think we were speaking about this earlier, and even like an image within a music video won't just have one reference. It'll have like 10 or 20 references, or something will even happen in the future that you'll say reminds me of that one image. And I love that idea then of, especially within the moving image and the idea of an image object as a sort of composite sketch of all of these different things, so it no longer being a singular thing, and then it having this sort of like responsibility to kind of contain and move within a space, and for people to pick up on these references or not pick up on them, but the ability to borrow from those, to take back from them, eventually for them to be inspired by what you've done with them, and back and forth. But I think one of the times that I really tried to specifically use this idea of like the image object in popular culture, like as a tool, like knowingly, for an audience, was a video I made 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, called Hyperlinked So It Didn't Happen. And the narrator for the video is called Phil, and he's a failed CGI rendering of an actor who's passed away, which was based on a rumor that was circulating that this would actually happen to this actor, and didn't. So I kind of had they said that they didn't make the copy, but I, in my imagination, imagined that they had, and it had kind of failed. It had not done the job that it was meant to do, and I really fell in love with the idea of this. Yeah, of what this image contained and represented to people, and what it would be to have it speak for itself, in reference to that responsibility, if it makes sense. And it's never stated in the video who the actor is, and I've never stated it in any like official texts. But it was really amazing because 9 times out of 10 across the board, people knew exactly who this was based on, and I just thought, yeah, because their relationship was always with this person as a moving image.
Yeah, I guess the way that these ideas come up in my work would be related to certain kinds of collective, or I would call them generic images that circulate. It's a bit more closely linked to kind of earlier discussions about representation and things like that, but I became quite fascinated, for example, with images of nature, which were derived from basically a kind of cliched idea of what nature was. And you know, if you search for something on the internet, like Niagara Falls, you end up with a lot of images of this place, and a lot of images that actually look the same, but taken by different people. Sorry, and it was through that kind of collection of images that I became interested in the possibility of trying to find what I would call, I guess, a more suitable context to perceive them. You know, because if people understand these images as being actually that place, you know, that's in a way a kind of illusion, right? So I wanted to think about these images, use these images in a way that was somehow like maintained what they were, but took away that kind of illusory aspect. So basically, I brought them back, and I recontextualized them within a kind of urban situation. There's no images of these works here, but you know, I mean, I guess. And it's also related, I think, to this idea that which has intensified in the present, where the the image. If we go back to this discussion about the image and the object, previously a kind of standard definition of the image is that the object precedes the image and not vice versa. But in the case of a generic image, you have a situation where the perception of the image is actually something that precedes the object. There's this image that circulates throughout a kind of collective imaginary, of a waterfall, for example. And you don't even have to go to the waterfall, and you already have this image in your mind. And when you do go to the waterfall, you're looking for that image as well. It's this sort of, it's a kind of a very kind of like sophisticated kind of tourist kind of gaze, I guess, right? And that's something I think that has intensified and really blurred the boundary between, this vision and materiality or objects.
Yeah, and like another point of interest, for example, another question I have for you, and this in relates again to the show. It was like my interest was kind of comment, or to make slightly problematic, not pop culture as such, but dominant visual regimes, for example, or dominant regimes of representation, better said, which are they privilege sites. So I was quite interested in kind of making that problematic through the artworks shown, and yeah, using pop culture in that sense as a reference that could make dominant regimes problematic. What's your interest? For example, why do you use Meryl Streep, for example, or the other actors? Why do you go to that kind of shared cultural imaginary, visual imaginary? What's your aim? Do you want to kind of uncover silent layers of those images, or do you just want to make them also problematic? Or yeah, what's your?
I think my primary interest in popular culture and just like not just images but also music was the emotional value behind it and how effective it is. I think I work with a pop songwriter for some of the scores within the videos that I make, and they're pretty much algorithms lying underneath certain songs. Like I can say, okay, there's this one by Miley Cyrus, and we all know it kind of sounds like the one by Sinead O'Connor, but then there's like Rihanna's Stay, and also like Great Big World and Christina Aguilera did this song, and they all make me want to cry, and I can assume they're all about breakups. Like, but what is it about the first three chords? And then he will say, actually, this is actually quite a known thing, and then the idea of people are now talking about the drop. When you go into pretty much any like H&M or shopping, there are so many drops in the music, and they're meant to like put you through an emotional roller coaster so that by the end of it, you're just like, I'll take all the shorts. And I just find that really amazing, and not from like a critical standpoint, but because I participate in it and I find it effective, and not in a way that I want to manipulate an audience, but because I think it's interesting to live within that space of not understanding why this is so effective each time.
Yeah, I think quite similar for me in a way. I mean, it's like I'm interested in sort of cliche and kitschy things, not really from an ironic perspective or like sort of a distant standpoint. I mean, also partly because of this kind of emotional like connection that happens where. In a way, these things can, even though you might be aware of it, these things can kind of still have some kind of like power or control over you, or manipulative force, which you can't control yourself. You're drawn to it, and yeah, and I think also. Trying to find, and for me it's always a question of trying to take these images and find a kind of material context for them, and normally it seems it always ends up being related to a certain kind of urban space or kind of technologized living.
Yeah, there's something to be said for emotional contagion, which was also the name of a study run by Facebook. on Facebook, which they basically wanted to do kind of what we're talking about, which was to find out, in a manipulative sense, actually, what are the algorithms that can recognize certain emotional statuses, which now they've made much easier by the fact that you can just like have an emoji that says I'm crying, I'm laughing, etc. But they wanted to see if they then grouped them all together into your feed. So someone's angry, another person's angry, another person's angry, if that then made you angry, which seems really basic, but was incredibly effective, and they proved that it is possible to spread emotion. And that I also found interesting in thinking about these, like, the breaking down of binaries that maybe never really existed, but the idea of emotions as a material, as something that has a very strong physical presence, that circulates, that we now know has a very high value and is very valuable monetarily, and that there are organizations that are going to great lengths to try and track the movement of these materials.
Yeah, in a way, I mean, that goes back to what we were also discussing before, this relationship between the digital and the real, and the emotions are, a big part of that. You were saying, like, shit happens. Things in the digital world, they do have impacts in reality.
Nothing's virtual anymore. Shit is real. Shit is definitely very real.
And the monetization of emotions is a big part of that. I mean, not only Facebook, but I mean in general, social media, the way they are monetizing and capitalizing on prior areas that were somehow external or very hardly capitalized, it's really impressive. I don't know if you want to say more about that, because your work is really related about that idea of how corporations are really feeding into that.
Yeah, I mean, I had a whole project called Agnes with the Serpentine Galleries. It was a digital commission with them, and Agnes she's still there and in a very reduced form now. She's becoming obsolete. A spam bot who lives on the Serpentine Galleries website. And this was at a time when the curator Ben Vickers and I were talking about, like, favoring a subjective value over an objective value, and we'd been discussing it for like 2 years, and by the time we got to that point, that subjective value was king. I mean, it had just gone through the roof, and I was just really interested in creating an interface and giving the interface by which is the point of exchange and whose job it is to collect your emotions, but also to share her emotions and to give her a voice so that she can discuss her condition and question the reasons, and also question her ability to recognize your emotions. So I've spoken about this before, but affective computing, which is how they know how we feel or how they think we know how they feel, it's based on very rudimentary feelings, and also oftentimes based on the principle that we only have one feeling at the same time, which in my experience is pretty much impossible. I just wanted to create a project that would do the thing that was happening actively, but then also question why it was doing it, and it's like how good it was. So a lot of times she would break down, or she would fail and send someone something in the mail to try and make up for it, because she realizes that she has limitations as a program. But I think in reality and in real life, we've been so conditioned to think that, like, anything that happens is amazing. So like when Siri first came out and you were like, hey Siri, where's the nearest pizza place? And Siri was like, the nearest pizza place is blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's not that amazing. Like, it is incredible. I understand it took a lot of work, like, to get there. But a lot of these intelligences still have a long way to go. And the reality is that the moment that we do, I believe that the moment that we do create a super intelligence, we won't even really know what it is, or we won't really even be able to understand it for many, many years after that, which is probably a more honest depiction of our condition and the way that we operate.
Do you harbor any sinister kind of, like, thoughts about that possibility, about that kind of alien intelligence or alien knowledge.
You mean like posthumans and transhumanism?
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Well, I asked, some of the research that I'm doing right now is with the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University, and their job is to look like 20,000 years into the future, and like how can we save humanity? And I asked them, and they're all also, most of them, transhumanists, which is the moment that we merge with technology. Like nanobots enter our bloodstream and repair our cells if we have cancer, or like our smartphones are in our brains, et cetera, et cetera. And I asked them, if you're for humanity and for, transhumanism, at what point do a group of people become, or that you become transhumans, and there's a group of people who are still very much humans, and how do you continue to advocate for them? So like I'm less like sinister about bots taking over the world, and more maybe skeptical about who's going to have access to all of these amazing things, and who's going to get left behind, and like how much knowledge can be spread in the meantime to like incorporate that. And that research group has a fantastic attitude. I mean, their goal is cohabitation. But the reality of how that works within the financial structures that we've set up, like, I'm not so sure. What about you guys?
Interesting to listen like about post-human, because like we're basically now post-human, but how post like how there's a temporal aspect of like how we imagine like what we are in common as. Because when you look at Nadim, some of Nadim's works, it's like there are a lot of them are like you're imitating, how germs look like under telescope. So like we basically have this world like that is visible but not visible, connected to the mechanic eyes of like telescope and horoscope, not horoscope, but like with like a lot of like microscope, and then a lot of different things. And then like now I found it very interesting like talking about, 7-8 years ago, we still talk about hyper-reality, like saying that, like we have simulacrum and blah, blah. Of course, we talk about the matrix. Now, basically, I think virtual and real basically is the same thing. It's like everything is virtually real. Things that you can't search on Google is not a thing. And of course, like it also like respond to Nadim's like research on the photos of nature, which are all second nature. That is like they all proceed like before what we actually like go to a desert or whatever. And this is interesting like when we do shows, because everybody knows like we spend a lot of time photoshopping the installation shots, because we know that my home institution is in Shenzhen, like which is not really an art center like New York, London, like or even Beijing, Shanghai. So we want people to see the show like in a certain way. But maybe what like so like what you said is like about the affective space that we are experiencing. Like I'm working on a show about Hong Kong, and then like Hong Kong as a spatial experience of urban fabric from like mass media or like from films, from video games and all that. So one of the works is like John Raffman's works about, like of Google Earth, like, his Google Earth project that he served, like part of it is like about Hong Kong, and also like his work like based on those gangster, gangster video games, like computer games. Of course, like we know that like it's not true that Hong Kong, like, after midnight, the whole city is taken over by gangsters, but the spatial experience, the affective intensity that is transformed through like the images, like even if it's more virtual, digital, like computer game images, they are real. So I found that very interesting when we talk about like virtual and real. Is basically like everything is like really virtual and everything is virtually real. And I think like I take the advantage of like being a Hong Kong. I grew up in Hong Kong, so like being a Hong Kong person talking about Hong Kong, so people won't like complain about there's another white person like talking about Hong Kong or China, that kind of thing. But at the same time, I can't say that like what is the real Hong Kong? Like do I grow up with the real Hong Kong? I mean, there are like so many places I have never been in the past 30 years, like, you know, like in Hong Kong. So that is interesting. And also how I see like part of the real urban fabric of Hong Kong, like Kowloon was city, that I have never been. And then how it is adopted by the Japanese architects who are very interested in this, like, you know, like crazy organic compound of human activities. And then how it is like adopted by Ghost in the Shell and other like mangas, and how it becomes the staple of like dystopian science fiction in the world. And like that is fake, but it's based on the spatial experience like in Hong Kong. So I'm very interested in how like it's like what everyone is talking about, like affective space and then virtual space, real space. I think they're all merged together. It's just one thing now. Like everything is like kind of hybridized, or it's like hybrid to begin with.
Yeah, and I've actually had a lot of trouble lately. I don't know how you guys feel about it with this word virtual, because in the dictionary it means fake. Like when you look up the standard definition and it's kind of like touted around. And I was saying earlier that like when I was in high school, we used to use the word virtually like some people use the word literally. Like I was virtually there. So something that means like not quite. Whereas like you mentioned simulacrum, and I'm a huge fan of Sturtevant, Elaine Sturtevant, and she talks about simulacra as this idea of then like a repetition and that becoming equal to or even greater than or just a different experience. And I think what I've never been able to understand is why people can't accept that it's just a different fabric. It's just a, you know, I'm still having this experience. And like some of the questions that are asked, I think, of artists who work in these mediums, first of all, the word, do you ever find there's a confusion for people between the words like virtual and fictional? Like instead of just saying like, has created like a fictional world of Hong Kong. And through that, you can have a very real experience, the same way that you go to the movie and you experience the story and it has allegories to things that happen in your life. But somehow the word virtual is much easier for people to use or slip in. And I don't know if you guys have experienced that.
Well, I mean, I guess in the context of fiction, there's a kind of, I mean, in virtual and fiction, there's both a kind of suspension, I guess, somehow, of reality, and but in a different way. I don't know. In a way, I'd still make a distinction, yeah. Of course, between those two, but also even between the real and the virtual. Like, it's just that, of course, I think we're being critical of a kind of very clear-cut binary between the real and the virtual. But you know, I feel there's still some sort of distinction which is made up of kind of different levels of intensity. So then it becomes much more ambiguous somehow instead. Or
like a fluidity.
Yeah.
From one area to another, or just like, yeah, but I mean, I would definitely agree with you. Like, it's to say again, like shit has been real for a while, like, and the experiences that you have in either of these like spaces, and just like it again, it's just different materials.
Yeah, it's interesting, the fictional and virtual, like the difference between them. I think sometimes like virtual is just like almost real, or it can be real, or like is what we're always talking about, like opening the intensity, like of like affective space, or in like that you can immerse in. I think the immersive part is important, like that it can be real or it can be not. But like fictional, it feels like a boat. You can just like, it has a certain distance that when you close it and it's over. Like it's obviously not, you know, like really related to you. I think that has like that kind of like immersive aspect of it when we talk about virtual.
Yeah, I mean, and this idea of the virtual having impact or being real, the show had a lot of that. I mean, lots of works were kind of playing with the virtual or even with the fictional as different terms, but playing with both as theoretically non-real things. But then all of them made direct connections, for example, to the body, to the fact that we are a material entity. And so the idea of mortality was also kind of present around there, which is something that you explore quite a lot. And even you, Nadim, because of your interest of the sublime, and the sublime has this idea of finitudes, or this kind of comparison with our insignificance, so to speak. So it also confronts us with our mortality. And it is interesting. I mean, and for me, this was really a striking thing in the works I selected, this idea of the body, and the body kind of coming back out of this immateriality, digital, everything, is fluid, and suddenly the human body comes back, both as a representation, but also like as this machine who is being teased out. And this was part of this idea that I mentioned at the beginning of questioning the visual by, poking our other senses. And
I mean, it just made me think about, well, just to go back to the virtual and fictional relation, that the experience of the virtual here, in this sense, would be something that's in a way more closely linked to this that certain kind of temporality, because it's a sort of like always a kind of presently lived experience, whereas the fictional is something that can be suspended, in some sense, temporally speaking.
Yeah. I mean, the thing with the body is getting like really cool at this moment. I feel really lucky because I was given the opportunity to really test this in a super literal way in a work that's on at the Sydney Biennial right now, where I took like a really basic video headset, basically IMAX for your face. You put your phone in and put on the headset and the headphones, and we built like a very long railway, like so rails that you can hang on to on either side down a very long tunnel. And people put the headset on and then they're asked to walk while they watch video. Quite simply because like this seems to me what a lot of people want to do anyway. They're on the street, they're just like walking, and there's like a real struggle between like you're bumping into people. I mean, this is what Google Glass wanted to do. Originally, I think it was meant to be a contact lens so that you could just like seamlessly do things. And it's just been amazing to watch audience members go through it and to see how some people have their relationship between the mind and the body is completely seamless, and they just rip right through and just walk and watch the video, and other people where it's almost like they're shell-shocked or they forget where they are and they stop in their place. Or you see people really struggling, like walking super slowly and trying to amble their way through.
And is that a digital native versus non-digital native?
Absolutely
device?
not. No. I mean, there was Penelope Zeidler, who is the wife of an architect at one of the houses that I filmed in that's in the video. I believe she's in her 80s, and I mean, she was in heels and a beautiful dress and just like zoomed right through it, really tore right through it. And then, like myself, it took me quite some time to be able to reconcile. And then, but there is a moment of undeniable freedom when you let go of this struggle between your mind and your body and prioritizing one over the other and let them kind of integrate themselves.
Just wondering, is that something that relates to your practice as a curator as well? The idea of the body and this return of the body, have you been noticing? Is that something that interests you?
Yeah, like apart from the post-human body thing that we're talking about, but also like how it's like what I talk about, how much time that we Photoshop out things, is like how we, of course, we accentuate visual experience when we curate shows. It's just like, what angles are all like, looks the best, like how we put shows together to make them look the best. So that is one thing. But how people like walk into things. So because I just opened a show about land-related art in China, but it's like from a totally opposite context from like traditional Chinese Western land art. And then it's interesting because it's called like the landscape of events in Chinese. And then when people walk in, in our photos, you basically can see every work and how they define their own spaces. But if you're inside, like you basically see, okay, there's like a wall and there's like some soil there and there's like some projection, and then we go to the back, there's like a huge temple at the back. Like how this kind of like, how the space and the works that define their own space and also the audience like bodies, and how he did it direct like the audience like to, you know, like invest their bodies, not invest, but like interact with the whole space. Like I think that is important, and this keeps reminding me that like apart from like photoshopping, that is just, like having a very good exhibition designer is very important. Like, you know.
Yeah, especially with things like video. Because it's sometimes a lot of work for an audience member, like to walk in. Videos can be like, you know, 20, 30, 45 minutes long. Where do they sit? There are other people in the room. I didn't witness it myself, but someone explained it to me and it sounded amazing. I think Philippe Parrenaud had a work where you could only experience his exhibition through a VR headset, and the goal was to erase your own body from the space, and that it was the only way that you could see the works without having to worry about other people's bodies or your own body within the space. And I just thought that was an interesting thing to do for an audience.
Daniel Stigman Mangrané, the work he had also at the Triennial, was actually, it worked in a way the other way around, because basically it was also with Ocula, with the glasses, and you would be inserted into an Amazon jungle, but very artificially rendered, so it was clearly not real. It was not trying to give an impression of actually being in the jungle, but you would not see even your body. So if you look down, your body would kind of disappear and you would become this kind of tree. But then at the same time, in the beginning, you would be very cautious of how people would be watching you around. So it was this really bizarre in-between state that you don't see your body, but you're permanently conscious of being watched and of your body, because you move in space as well, and of your body being there. Maybe we can open for some questions or comments if there are any, because we need, there's.
Hi, I'm Mitzi, and my question is, if virtual and real is the same, so how do you think about online gallery? Could they actually replace real gallery?
I think maybe there can, but the physical one doesn't have to go away.
Yeah.
I mean,
there are some people who like objects that they can carry and bring home and hang on the wall.
I mean, and like objects will pretty much always exist, like, because we still need a computer to look at stuff and like my hands to find it. But I always think it's funny when this sort of like virtual panic, like everything is going to go away, and like I love the attitude of like these things can continue to exist together, and we just have a much larger breadth of experiences to choose from.
Or they exist on the same ontological plane. I mean, you know, they're not totally the same thing, but they have the same weight and grounded in the same weight in our perception.
Yeah, and the amazing thing about a work that is found online, I mean, maybe not necessarily in an online gallery, is that you don't have to leave your house. So then you kind of also do away with the issues of making someone leave their house, go somewhere, you know, deal with like the situations of an institution. But again, it doesn't work for all works, so I think it depends on the piece itself.
And a lot of collectors outside buy through looking at images on the iPads. So I think this one kind of already exists.
But was your question like more about like if it's possible to see was this like if you can see something online or if you can buy something online? It seems like there's this kind of distinction, you know.
You know, because the development of art is there was no video, there was no virtual reality, and there was no photograph. So if we could see the same kind of work through internet, why I need to go to a real gallery? And I understand what you're talking about. If I see a sculpture or maybe installation, I need to be there. But there are some forms you don't, in my opinion, you don't really need to go there to see it. And when I talk to some collectors, one of them told me that it will lose certain texture of the art. But what about photography?
I tried to have Agnes because she has many different multiple formats, some that work in a gallery space, but her online form, to have her in a gallery space, and it didn't work. Just because of the opening hours of the institution. She works 24 hours. You get something different at 4 a.m. that you would at like 5 a.m. Also, the camera didn't work for archiving them. So sometimes I could actually see people like trying to use her in the institution. And it's a completely different relationship than when you're at home. So you could say the same thing for sculptures, that you need to be in a physical gallery space, whereas there are definitely works that work much better and that can only exist online.
I mean, it's also like, I don't know. It just made me think about buying something from Ikea. You know, if you go, you can very easily buy something from the Ikea website, and basically Ikea is, you know, developed along this model of buying a kind of image of a lifestyle, you know, and it's actually perfect to look at it on the website. But there's also that whole experience of going, you know, that kind of hell of being there, and you know, which is a bit like art fair, you know. But you know, which creates a certain kind of, you know, experience, which is quite different, you know, even though you're looking at the same thing.
That's actually quite good, because also sometimes when you order something from IKEA online, it comes back and it's definitely not as aspirational as it was in the pictures.
And, I don't know, maybe for you it could be interesting. There's a project called Magic Hong Kong, which is a virtual art fair that we just launched last week, I think, to coincide with Art Basel. And yeah, it does not exist. There's no site. It's only online, and it's all fictional. The booths are fictional, but the artworks are not. So that's maybe an experiment. But it's all about experiences as well, rather than, I'm not so interested into the market, let's say. So it's more for me as an experience, and I think it's two very different experiences. And sometimes you can choose to have both, but sometimes if you live, you know, across the world, you only have one. It's like the documentation of exhibitions that started 50, 40 years ago, before there was no documentation. And once they started to be documented, then people could access them after they happened and from other points in the world. So, yeah, as we were saying before, the virtual and the real, etc., it's not that they are opposites or that they need necessarily to substitute or to replace each other. They can just coexist in various different forms.
If recently, nowadays, virtual has become a reality, like you said, whether the transformation of the reality we would find in the future. Yeah.
Oh, what sort of transformation? So what sort of transformation of reality we'll find in the future?
Yeah, because you said 18 years ago, virtual is like a fantasy, but now it's become reality. So in the future, what kind of transformation? Yeah.
I hope.
According to you, no, not what a scientist.
I definitely couldn't predict that anyway. But I have like a doomsday answer and like a positive answer. I think I'll go for the positive one. But like my hope is that the transformation is that we're able to accept multiple realities and multiple points of view, and to be able to move fluidly through and within them. I think like a doomsday sort of thing is that because of the structures that exist and because of things that the transformations towards realities and new systems that we dream of or that have been promised to us will. Yeah, I don't want to. It's too sad. I'll stop there. Sorry.
I mean, it's a combination of the two for me. I mean, like everything that we've been talking about somehow with the descriptions of the bodily experience, you know, in these exhibitions, it just reminds me of a kind of schizophrenic episode. You know, I mean, where you kind of lose sense of your body and you become engulfed by the space, and if that is, you know, the potential kind of reality of the future, then so be it. But you know, there's also this sense in which that there'll be this great psychological upheaval, which have to be endured, you know, in order to get to that stage, which I think would be quite painful, at least for us.
Painful, but I mean, because I read something about. This is kind of gross, but the first head transplants, yeah, or body transplant. Basically, there was going to be some switching around, and someone said that even if they were able to achieve this, that it would be absolutely horrendous because the experience of that would drive you completely insane because no human had ever experienced that. So I think we don't want that necessarily. But I think what could be really interesting within that transformation is like just a little bit of a loss of the individual. So if there is an ability to accept multiple realities, then this very Western strain of individualism, to some extent, would have to subside, which has caused a lot of not so great things, in my opinion.
See, I was going to text my fortune teller. I have a professional feng shui fortune teller who tell me what to do like every month. But I mean, I agree that like, we can't really predict, and it's harder and harder for us to imagine like the future. Like looking at the science, like the sci-fi movies in the 60s and the sci-fi movies now, like when we look at like, you know, 2000 when all the say like it's a very, very different world. And when we watch Her, and it's like it's a future LA that is shot in the Shanghai now. So I think when Fukuyama talked about the end of history, and he got a lot of criticism, but now, like, I think a lot of people agree with that, like, it's the end of history. Like, we can't even imagine what is next. We have tomorrow, but we may not have a future.
But I get really excited by that because the future has looked the same for the last 50 years.
Yeah, it's just like forever bathing under like the sun of all of our lives and that kind of thing. Like, but yeah, that is like interesting. It's like harder and harder to imagine a future that is like a rupture from now. I think it's like a forever sunshine of the present. That is one of the. We may have smaller cars. We may have like smaller cell phones and laptop. We may even have chips like installed in our body. But I guess it's like exciting to think about, like, oh, we don't have to imagine about the future. Like, for the long history of politics and contemporary art, like, we do have to imagine, like, what the future is, especially if you're working in a museum, you think about your collection is just like, oh, like, can it stand, like, for the knowledge and, you know, like, other things in, you know, 50 years, like, in the next 50 years and all that. I do think that it's, like, harder to imagine the imagination of future is like harder and harder. Like, of course, I hope that we can imagine and think that way, like we live in the space and all that is possible. But yeah, and the other thing is like harder and harder to think about the outside. You know, like, you know, when we think that we kind of like know or like know part of the secrets of the universe, when everything, like when all the land artworks that are like in the middle of the nowhere are just like one click away on like Google Earth, then where is the outside? When like we have like so many works that are outside the museum, like how do we expand? Like what is the outside? I think it just doesn't exist anymore. It's just like when we watch Pacific Rim, like the kaijus, I mean, the aliens are not from the outer space, like, you know, like light years away, but it's from the inside, like another dimension of the Earth. It's just like, so I think how we look at this fissure in another perspective and dimension is important.
Okay, I'm really sorry to cut it short, but we need to finish. So thank you, and thank you all for coming.